The Space Shuttle Challenger is destroyed just a little more than 1 minute after liftoff.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical
All
miles.
7 astronauts on board are killed.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Tonight, reporting from Washington.
It is the worst disaster in the history of the American space program, and President Reagan has declared a week of mourning for the 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, who lost their lives on their way into space this morning. Now, we know that many of you have heard the news many hours ago and may even have seen some of our extended coverage this afternoon. But many others of you, we surmise, have been at work, and thus we're going to spend virtually our entire broadcast this evening on what is not only a crushingly sad day for families, friends, and colleagues of the astronauts, but also an enormous shock to the manned space program, which before today had gone so well. Never before have American lives been lost in flight. We will try to answer many of your questions, but as of this evening, many questions remain unanswered. We begin at Cape Canaveral with ABC's John Quinones.
They gathered for what turned out to be their last meal at 6:48 this morning, the ceremonial breakfast. For months, they had trained together. Astronaut ELLISON ONIZUKA from Hawaii, the star of this mission, New Hampshire schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, mission commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, astronauts Judith Resnick and Ronald McNair, and payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. After 3 days of delays, they appeared tired but quickly rejuvenated by applause as they headed for the launch pad.
Scobie, followed by mission specialist Judy Resnick, Ron McNair, and pilot Mike Smith, followed by Krista McAuliffe, teacher in space, ELLISON ONIZUKA, and payload specialist Greg Jarvis.
Final preparations before liftoff. The ground crew gives McAuliffe an apple for the teacher, and wishes of good luck. Initially, liftoff was scheduled for 9:38 this morning, but again there were problems. A hard freeze overnight left ice on the launch pad, a 2-hour delay, and then NASA discovers a faulty fire detector on board the shuttle, another hour's delay while it's replaced. Finally, the liftoff was set for 11:38. A crowd of some 500 spectators, including 18 visiting school children from McAuliffe's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, waited anxiously and then counted down. The liftoff appeared flawless. The spectators, including Krista McAuliffe's parents, Grace and Edward Corrigan, watched proudly through tears of joy. 65 seconds into flight, NASA Control orders Commander Scobie to go to full power.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Suddenly, an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
NASA loses all communication with Challenger, but the crowd still does not realize that something's gone wrong. Within seconds, Challenger disintegrates.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
For the spectators and Krista McAuliffe's parents, joy turns to confusion, worry, and a realization of tragedy. The $1.2 billion spaceship, its 7 crew members, and their satellite payload disappear.
I thought the flight was going fine. And then I heard them say major malfunction. And then the person beside me said it's exploded. And it was... I couldn't speak. It was...
Within minutes, emergency rescue teams parachuted in, converging on a search area 18 miles east of Cape Canaveral.
Debris continued to fall for 50 minutes and more, and obviously you can't send aircraft and ships into an area where debris is falling, where they themselves may be endangered.
Late this afternoon, after 6 hours of searching, NASA reports they found no survivors.
These searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
Tonight, NASA and Cape Canaveral are in mourning. Tonight at Cape Canaveral, Vice President George Bush, accompanied by Senators Jake Garn and John Glenn, both former astronauts, expressed the nation's condolences to the families of the astronauts. Bush had a special message for American school children.
You must try to understand that spirit, bravery, and commitment are what make not only the space program, but all of life worthwhile. We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on.
John Quinones, ABC News, Cape Canaveral.
This whole concept of a teacher in space has been important to the country, but especially to the children, as the Vice President alluded ever since President Reagan in 1984 suggested there be a teacher in space. It was going to be a very big day in Krista McAuliffe's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, and especially at the high school where she taught. ABC's Jay Shadler was there.
Krista McAuliffe's students and friends at Concord High School were ready to watch a dream come true this morning. Instead, they became witnesses to a nightmare.
2, 1, and liftoff.
In the moments after the launch, their celebrations drowned out the first news of the tragedy. But the clamor turned to quiet as this picture burned itself into their memories.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water.
Some people were covering their eyes, and some people were just watching the TV set with a blank look on their face.
It was really quite dramatic. At first, you know, everyone was really happy, all these smiles, and then suddenly you saw a lot of people crying in the halls, and it was really pretty sad.
Just moments before, Eileen O'Hara, Krista McAuliffe's good friend and classroom substitute, had shared this haunting sentiment with a local reporter.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to watch because I want her to be safe and I want her to have fun.
Now the public celebration had turned into private mourning and shock.
She was a part of us. She was part of a family. And it's like, if your sister or brother died, she'll be remembered. It was a hell. Just a hell.
Though Krista McAuliffe's students and friends have known her here in Concord for years, she became known to the nation when she decided to pursue her dreams. Those dreams have been sparked by President Reagan's announcement a year ago for a teacher astronaut. The search for that history maker brought 11,000 applications, but only one made the final grade.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe.
From the outset, she approached this mission and her training with the same ideals she brought to the classroom.
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always asked my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher.
She wore her spirit on her face, and her hometown loved it.
Difficult to say.
Now they are remembering it. A special counselor will be brought to Concord High tomorrow to help students begin dealing with their loss. But perhaps Krista McAuliffe's own words echo the best advice.
To follow your instincts and go for your dreams, and I hope they achieve that.
Jay Shadler, ABC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
When Challenger was 10 miles up and 18 miles downrange and that explosion occurred, we all knew a great deal about Krista McAuliffe, but we've become so accustomed to the shuttle going up and coming down now that the other astronauts on board were just not as well known to us. Well, they are today, and ABC's Stone Phillips has been looking at them.
When they posed, it was like a portrait of America. Men and women, war veterans and first-time astronauts, parents, and even a classical pianist. Their commander was Francis Scobie, age 46, from Washington State, an astronaut after 22 years in the Air Force. This was his second shuttle mission. Second in command, pilot Michael Smith, age 40, a decorated Navy pilot from North Carolina. Like Scobie, he'd seen combat in Vietnam and trained as a test pilot. And like the commander, he was a husband and father. This was Smith's first shuttle mission. Mission specialist ELLISON ONIZUKA was the first Hawaiian astronaut who believed in the benefits of the space program.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
ONIZUKA is survived by his wife and 2 daughters. 36-year-old mission specialist Judy Resnick was a shuttle veteran, her assignment to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm. She was on board the shuttle Discovery in 1984 when a launch was aborted after the engines had fired. Gregory Jarvis was on board to conduct tests on the effects of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. Born in Detroit, trained as an Air Force satellite engineer, Jarvis was on his first shuttle mission. Ronald McNair, age 36, from South Carolina, brought a background in physics and laser technology to the shuttle program. This was the second trip to space for a husband and father who saw space travel as a calling for mankind.
I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore.
These six, along with Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, now a tragic page in NASA history. Stone Phillips, ABC News.
When we come back, we'll try to analyze what happened. It isn't easy. But it really happened. Well, the real answer may be a very long time in coming, but ABC's Lynn Scher, who covers space for us on a regular basis and has for a long time, is with us tonight in our Los Angeles bureau. Lynn?
Well, Peter, all the NASA experts, those review boards, are certainly going to check all the data they can gather, and they are going to be looking at all the pictures they can see. And those are the exact same pictures that we have been looking at also, and we've been taking a closer look at those last tragic moments. Here you see what they call a nominal ascent. All those words, textbook, picture perfect, and then suddenly a tiny flame just where the fuel lines go from the big external tank into Challenger itself. On the left, with the arrow, a plume where gases from the tank are forming, obviously feeding the fire. Now you will see the flame creeping up the external tank in between the tank and the shuttle itself. This is the beginning of the huge, catastrophic explosion that absolutely engulfed the entire system. You will see a second explosion right at the top of that big external tank. This is obviously what put the entire thing into flames and probably what destroyed the shuttle almost instantly. Now for a moment the smoke clears and we see emerging apparently the top of Challenger. We think this is the last picture we have ever seen of Challenger before it fell to the sea with its precious cargo. And as the sequence is going to continue, you will see that mammoth, horrible explosion on the right. One of the solid rocket boosters split away now from the tank and the shuttle itself. These boosters cannot be controlled once they're lit, so it has obviously gone off on its own into the wrong place, but it does not appear, I repeat, appear from what we can see that it was the cause of the explosion or that anything happened to it. So that's the sequence. We can see that. We can try to understand it. What we don't know is why it happened, and that's what we now need to find out. Peter?
Lynn, thank you very much. Joining us tonight from Houston is the former astronaut Gene Cernan from the Apollo program, and he also has seen this same sequence repeated many times throughout the day. Gene, I know your reluctance to speculate and share it with you, but do you see anything in those pictures which give us a clue?
I think the analysis Lynn presented, the only one we have to work with because you know, we don't have access to the data, and it would take even us, if we had the time, weeks and weeks to analyze it. But just simply from the pictures, it sounds to me like her analysis, as it was portrayed, has got some substance to it. We can't answer why. We don't know why. We don't know why it might have happened, but from those pictures, we might very well be able to see what happened. Remember that tank that she referred to is carrying thousands and thousands of pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Hydrogen is a propellant. It burns, it explodes. Liquid oxygen is the oxidizer, like air, which supports the fire, which allows it to burn. And if you burn it as a controlled substance, if you meter it and you burn them together properly like you do in the engines, it's an ally. But when you allow them to join in an uncontrolled atmosphere, what can happen did happen.
Gene, very quickly, I'm afraid, but can you tell us why there was no escape mechanism on board today?
Well, the shuttle was designed early with ejection seats, so that if something occurred, the crew in its first 3 or 4 flights could get out. It was a test program. The evolution of the shuttle in an operational vehicle took those seats out. The only escape mechanism, as it was planned, was that the shuttle itself, with an impending problem, one you could see coming, could get off those tanks, turn around, and land back at Kennedy Space Center. Obviously, they did not have time for that because they didn't know the catastrophe was occurring.
Gene Cernan, thank you very much from Houston, and Lynn Scher from Los Angeles. When we come back, we'll have the reaction from the President and from Congress. Anywhere else in the country, shock and disbelief and sorrow, the President took the unprecedented step of postponing the State of the Union message, which he was due to get to Congress tonight. He will give it next week. He did go on television late this afternoon to comfort the nation. ABC Sam Donaldson at the White House.
The flag was lowered at the White House and other government buildings late this afternoon as President Reagan led the nation in mourning with a short address from the Oval Office.
Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss.
The day began with the president conferring with congressional leaders about his State of the Union message scheduled for delivery tonight. When he heard the news of the shuttle disaster, his first thought was to go ahead with it. You can't stop governing the nation, Mr. Reagan told a group of reporters. But as the president and his advisors kept watching the television replays of the explosion and the reactions of relatives, school children, and others, Mr. Reagan changed his mind.
The president thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred.
The State of the Union speech was put off until next Tuesday. Vice President Bush was dispatched to Cape Canaveral to express the president's concern to people there, and Mr. Reagan, in his own remarks, tried to explain to the school children who had watched the explosion, he said, why such things happen.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
This was to have been another night of triumph for the president, who had planned to tell the Congress and the nation how good things are in the country. But the shuttle disaster has changed all that. Officials here are shaken by the loss and by the fact it has happened on Mr. Reagan's watch. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
This is Britt Hume. Officials usually keep emotions under control in Washington, but today there was no hiding them.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
There were some calls to rein in NASA.
I think that some limit has to be placed on the PR that NASA indulges in.
I think the policy of sending civilians into space obviously had better be reevaluated.
But that seemed a minority sentiment.
Let us remember, in silent prayer, those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago.
Now their names become history. But that drive of the human spirit will not die. In that flash of fire, it will be reborn again in other young men and young women who will read about them and learn.
Florida Congressman Nelson, who returned aboard the shuttle Columbia just last week, had lost none of his enthusiasm.
This is part of what you understand is part of the risk that you're taking. Of course I would go again, even if it were tomorrow.
I would go again tomorrow. If NASA would let me go, I would go again.
Unlike another costly and dangerous program, the military, the space program has always been popular here, seeming to represent something Americans like to think is theirs, the future. This tragedy may shake that feeling, but if today's reactions are a guide, not for long. Britt Hume, ABC News, on Capitol Hill.
Well, this tragedy has had repercussions well beyond the borders of the United States. When we come back. Bill Blakemore now makes clear there was shock and grief all across the country today and all around the world.
That poor teacher, you know, you just think everything is just down pat, and then something like this happens. I feel awful.
The feeling that you get, that cold feeling all over, that only happens maybe 5 times in your lifetime.
Space shuttle explode, get it right now.
At midday, word flashed between people everywhere across the country.
Didn't you know about it? Yeah, the space shuttle blew up this morning.
Oh, yeah. I think it's very tragic. I think it's the most tragic thing since the death of Kennedy himself.
And as with Kennedy's death, people remember where they were the moment they heard.
I was in an elevator in Midtown Manhattan, and somebody said the shuttle just came down.
But it was in those schoolrooms around the country.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Can we get the cameras?
Pilot Mike Smith, Commander Dick Scobie, Judy West, there it is. There you see.
The kids invited almost as if to a party for a live classroom lesson from space turned suddenly into a lesson in mortality.
He's
think that there's so much technology that, you know, they could keep things like this from happening.
I was horrified. I didn't think that would happen. I didn't think that would happen.
The shock was immediately felt around the world. Within 30 minutes of the explosion, Soviet TV showed it. In the Frankfurt airport, travelers stopped in their tracks. Back in America, test pilot Chuck Yeager showed the professionals' attitude to danger.
You don't give an awful lot of thought to it because, number one, you can't do anything about it when it happens.
But for most of us today, there was no professional detachment, just the sudden finality of it.
It was just a nice liftoff, and then right out the clear blue sky, boom, it happened, and it just made me feel bad.
Bill Blakemore, ABC News.
It made us all feel bad. We'll be back in a moment.
There's only one story today, the death of the Space Shuttle Challenger and of 7 American pioneers. That's our focus tonight.
It really was largely because of the teacher, Krista McAuliffe. We can't recall a time since man set foot on the moon when much of the nation, and because it was so many children, were engaged in a particular mission. When President Reagan went on television this afternoon, he was talking not only to the children, but to all of us, trying to comfort a nation.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Very often, but particularly today, this program seems inadequate to tell it all and to share it all. Later this evening on the full ABC network at 10 o'clock, 9 Central Time, we'll have a full hour special on today's tragedy, and then even later this evening on Nightline, Ted Koppel and his guests will go as deep.
For our young children, the space program has been all triumph. But if there is some gray in your hair, you remember there is a price to be paid by those who pushed the frontiers of science. The U.S. space program was at first driven by fear. The Russians had beaten us into orbit with Sputnik. It would not be the last embarrassment. America, it seemed, just couldn't get its act together.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
There would be a price to pay for reaching that goal. On January 27, 1967, an electrical fire broke out aboard the Apollo space capsule. Astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were killed. A little over 2 years later, President Kennedy's goal was finally reached.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
They are words few of us alive to hear them will ever forget, just as we remember where we were the day man landed on the moon, just as we will always remember what we were doing when we learned of today's tragedy. President Reagan remembered 15 years after Apollo while talking to the crew of the Challenger after they had rescued a satellite in space.
And Terry, I guess you made one long reach for man this morning when you snapped that satellite with the 50-foot robot arm.
The shuttle program captured the imagination of a whole new generation of Americans for whom landing a man on the moon was something to read about in history class.
The shuttle will take space out of its, or eliminate its present experimental nature and really make it a routine operation. And by the time Andy here's old enough to be a pilot, we'll be making flights to space that won't even make the paper.
And you wouldn't have to be an astronaut or a test pilot to work in space. That's what astronaut Judy Resnick told me during an interview in 1978 for a Channel 8 documentary.
The nature of the space shuttle and all the experiments it's going to be doing requires people trained in the various scientific and technical disciplines to carry out the experiments and the missions.
Judy Resnick was one of the 7 astronauts who died today. If it is true we can take a lesson from history, then on this sad day, we should remember that after the deaths of the 3 Apollo astronauts, Americans mourned their dead and then went on to greater triumphs in space. David Margulies, Channel 8 News.
The sun is now set in Florida, and search planes have been recalled until first light when they'll resume flying patterns over the Atlantic, 50 miles out from Cape Canaveral. Pilots say the biggest piece of debris from the space shuttle disaster today is 2 by 10 feet long. But all that has been found is from the giant fuel tank. nothing from the Shuttle Challenger. The launch was this morning at mid-morning after 2 brief delays. It was very cold at Cape Canaveral, but the skies were brilliant blue as the Challenger lifted off and began what looked like another picture-perfect and very routine launch. It began what's called the roll program, turning on its back for the trek downrange when at 10 miles out,
Challenger now heading downrange.
traveling at nearly 2,000 miles an hour, something went wrong. The astronauts had been at reduced power, 64% at this point, and were told by Houston Control to go to 104%. That is full throttle. The camera goes to a close-up at that point.
We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The crowd at this point still did not know that anything was wrong, because a brilliant flash usually accompanies separation of the giant rockets from the space shuttles. The crowd still was thinking that everything was all right, although there were a few murmurs of surprise at the giant flash. Then Mission Control announced that something indeed was wrong, and debris began falling from the sky. It was at that point, I think, that people began to have hope, Tracy and Midge, that something miraculous could occur, and perhaps the astronauts, some of the crew at least, might be saved. Some debris was seen, looked like big pieces. 2 of the solid-stage rockets, which we now know they were, and not the shuttle itself, flew on into the sky for a period of time, and there was hope, I think, at that time that perhaps the shuttle was still flying and could, as had been planned, return to the Cape if something went wrong. There is a way that it can return if it's high enough, and indeed it was. It was not for several hours, I think 2.5, nearly 3 hours, that NASA announced that the search had turned up no survivors.
Of course, there was some confusion, though, too, John, because as those 2 rockets left the side, they were still flying. They were kind of just propelling themselves off into space. Those things are built to be retrieved, of course, and one of them actually was carried back into the ocean by a parachute that was automatically loosened inside that particular rocket. And there was some confusion immediately. I think that there was perhaps already some kind of a search effort that was on the scene. That couldn't happen for approximately an hour because there was debris falling for all of that period of time.
The range safety officer was watching radar and had to hold the search effort back until the big pieces of debris stopped falling. So 55 minutes later, the ships finally and the helicopters were able to go into the scene. There was another parachute also, which came down a fairly short time after that, and obviously there was a person in the parachute, and it was thought perhaps that had been one of the astronauts. That was a paramedic parachuting in to look for survivors.
It was very tragic, and you could see the poignancy on the faces of the people. They really didn't know that it had been a major malfunction, as they were calling it.
And didn't want to believe even after they knew.
In Austin, news events scheduled for today were eclipsed.